Now we're going to knit. So you've got your cast on one side, and on the other side you've got your other needle. Now, I'm going to give the verse that we teach with, and we also have a song in the back of our grade 1 book that goes with this. I'm going to just do the verse. And the verse goes, under the fence, so you're going under that first stitch, see? Caterpillar's feet are there at the bottom. I'm holding, this is a lot like the 2-needle cast on. You're taking the ball yarn, you're going to catch your sheep, back we come, and again, if you've gotten really good at that 2-needle cast on, you're thinking, oh, she's just going to put that up there on that needle, but we're not. This time what we're going to do is we're going to slip this stitch here off. Let's watch that again. Under the fence, catch the sheep from the ball yarn, back we come, off we leap. Under the fence, catch the sheep, back we come, off we leap. I know there are many different verses out there that are used in Waldorf schools. I encourage you to use whichever ones you prefer. This is just one that I've known for many, many years, and one that all of the children have learned to knit with. And I can still hear it in my head when I knit personally. I always am thinking, under the fence, catch the sheep, back we come, off we leap. Under the fence, catch the sheep, back we come, off we leap. You want to be sure that your knitting is not too tight. It will probably tend to be tight in the beginning, but if it's too tight to put your needle underneath into the stitch, then you want to loosen up a little bit. Another thing I want to remind you to do is to breathe. Oftentimes when we're learning something new, we have a tendency to hold our breath. We don't want to do that. There we go, we've worked an entire row. Now my caterpillar's feet are kind of all over the place, aren't they? So what I like to do is I like to sort of tug them down, get them all where they belong, and then the right needle becomes the left needle. You turn them around and you start again. And be very careful on this very first stitch here. The first stitches always seem to be a little fatter than the others. There's a tendency to want to put your needle into it this way. Be very careful not to do that. Look at where the ball yarn is. Make a little tug on it if you need to. And make sure that your needle goes under that way. So you're on top of that stitch. Turn around. Back we come. Off we leap. At first, your knitting's not going to look like much, so it's okay. It's going to frustrate you maybe a bit. It's going to not feel right. But as you do it more, you see the ease that it flows for me. I've been knitting for several years, so it will take you time to get to this place. My guess is most people probably, if you're knitting diligently and you're enjoying yourself and you're doing it regularly, you probably get to an easy place of flowing within the first month. There we go. Looks a little messy, I know. There we go. Now you can start to see the stitches come together. If you look very closely, you have 2 rows here. We have this bottom row and this top row meets it. So these together, you will see it counted as a rib. This is considered a rib, or 2 rows. I like to call them ribs when they're children, when we're teaching children, because the children can very easily see the 2 ribs together. And then when you say, oh, you need to knit 10 ribs, we know that's 20 rows, but 10 sounds a lot easier to them than 20. And I bet you'll get less bulking from that. Now, oftentimes we'll have mistakes, knitting mistakes, and or we'll drop a stitch and you'll notice you have a gigantic hole. And you know, sometimes there really is no way to fix a missed stitch. You may have to just go back. I would definitely not go back and undo the entire project. If you mess something up, you can always unknit what you've knitted. The best way to do that is to reverse engineer the knit stitch. So I'm going to do a knit stitch here. So under my fence, catch my sheep, back we come, off we leap. So then if you look at the back of that, you see I've got stitches on this needle and stitches on this needle. If you look at the back of this, here's the stitch right here that I just knitted. Now if I had a mistake there and I needed to do something, if I slip my needle right in there, gently and slowly go to the end, I can let that new stitch off, and there it's back on the needle. So I can, if I've dropped a stitch or messed up and knitted where I should have purled, or perhaps I should have decreased, then it's very easy to sort of go back and do that. If you drop a stitch, it looks a little bit like this. And you just, the best thing I can tell you is not to panic when this happens. Because you've got all these stitches down here at the end of your needle. And oftentimes, and this has happened to me, I've come into the living room where my knitting was, where I laid it in the chair, thinking that nobody would bother it. And some little person has come through and pulled my needle out. Now if you don't panic, Mom, you can often just guide your needle back in there. And you can definitely recover and catch your breath and not yell at the person who pulled your knitting out. Because most of us, if that's happened, know who it might be. If, however, you notice that a stitch was dropped, so say you have this off here, and you see, watch as the stitch is dropping where this is going. So when it drops and it pulls out of here. So what needs to happen is you need to be able to pull that back up. You can do that with a crochet hook. Sometimes if you catch it in time, you can just do it with a knitting needle and pull it back up. If you've knit through and you've got sort of a problem, you will have to go back and fix that. But in first projects, especially with children, I do not require that they have a perfect first project. The idea of the first projects is for them to be able to have something to grow from. So I allow mistakes in first projects. I also allow them to leave their knitting projects out for the fairies so that the fairies can help them. It's a little bit like the elves and the shoemaker. If they leave their stuff out on the table, oftentimes the fairies will come and knit a row or two and tidy up some dropped stitches, or do some stitches that they may be having trouble with, or even just some straight knitting. My daughter, who is 9.5, has been working on a belt, and she chose to use a yarn that is very small and very small needles. And I think when she began the project, she wasn't really thinking about how long that would take her. And so she's often very disillusioned with this belt that she's trying to finish. And so she'll leave it out on the counter with a sweet little note for the knitting fairies, asking if they would please help her to work on her belt. And sure enough, they always find a way to work in rows for her. She wakes up in the morning with sort of renewed vigor to work on that belt, because those fairies have helped her, and she feels very excited then to sort of move on. So I'm sort of knitting through here and just knitting to a couple so that you can see what it should look like. And then I will show some very simple adding and decreasing stitches, and then we'll also teach binding off.